There it is, laid out on the table. All the mats, the Germans and the Soviets on their side. Early part of a setup. Still some experimentation and learning going on. It's funny, you never quite know how a set of rules will grab you. This is a massive rule book. I found it to be a lot like reading the tax code. I don't mean that as an insult, it's just that there's a tremendous number of procedures, guidelines, conditions, exceptions, all kinds of information spread throughout the book. As I got towards the end of the rules, I thought to myself, well, what the hell do I do? I didn't have a good sense of the game from all that information. Now, fortunately, these rules do come in PDF format. So what I did was I got the PDF and then extracted pages and sections, kind of rearranged it into a flow that suited my way of thinking and learning. I organized it into kind of the simple steps of the sequence of play, and then the drill down details of each step, then the larger sort of cross-cutting concepts that go through the whole game. And having them split out into PDF form made them much easier to refer to. I could use my favorite tablet to look at them pretty quickly. It saved me a lot of thumbing through pages and flipping back and forth. Even scrolling through PDF can be a pain in the neck. So once I got that organized, I really progressed through learning and playing the game a lot more easily. These are the event cards. This is my homemade event card mat. They supposedly have one available, but I don't know, it was kind of cropped off and I couldn't print the damn thing out, so I just stole the ideas and made my own. But this is one of the first things I stumbled on, these event cards. I assumed too much based on what I had played in other games and systems about how event cards work. This is a little different in the sense that they're not randomly drawn, they are selected. And even though the rules say selected, I just kept thinking drawn. I had to really read a lot of stuff, in addition to the rules to make that clear to me. So the idea is you have a whole set of cards that are available to you. They come in sizes. And you choose which cards you want to have in your hand. There's a certain weight of cards you're allowed to have, certain combinations. 2 small or 1 medium and 1 large, whatever, so things like that. So there's only so many you can have in your hand at a given time, and you're only allowed to draw them on the first turn of every month. But you're allowed to go through your entire deck and pick whatever ones you like and put them in your hand. So this is kind of your operational planning. If you're thinking of being aggressive, you're going to want to take, maybe cards that really advantage you in the attack. If you're in a point where you need to consolidate, bring your lines up or something, you might take things that are more, passive about building up your rear areas, your logistics, or your resources. But completely at your discretion which ones you want to put in your hand. For the most part, all of the cards are, positive effects. There aren't any, damaging cards that you might have, like, the plague struck and I lost half my forces. Nothing like that. There's no damaging effects you wouldn't be able to particularly predict. You pick the ones you like, put them together to represent your plans, and of course your opponent's going to do the same, and you'll get advantages, they'll get advantages, it might disadvantage you, and so on. It's all at your discretion. The cards have certain availabilities. It basically boils down to you can play it once per season. Once you play it, it goes back in the return the next season, spring, summer, winter, fall. You play it and you discard it for the year. It doesn't come back until the first turn of the following year. Or you take it out of the game completely. It's a one-time play. They use some specific terminology for that, set-asides and discards, but that's really how it boils down. Now, I'm terrible at this game. I don't think I have the feel of it at all, but I really don't have the feel of the cards. It's like there are so many. I don't think I've gotten a sense of how best to structure and how best to choose cards, for the different parts of the game, different phases of the campaign. But I think that's an art that will be learned and probably be pretty rewarding as time goes on. This is a operational / strategic game. Many games of this ilk have a similar flow. Often it's a kind of a reinforcement entry, a movement, a supply check of some kind, combat, and then a supplemental move that is often attenuated. It kind of represents the ability to take advantage of the gains made during combat. Then you flip to the opponent, they do the same things, and that constitutes a turn. This game is pretty similar, except it does adjust that flow a little bit, and in a couple of ways are important, and another way this maybe looks important on the surface, but kind of isn't. Now the first thing you do in a turn is called the logistics phase. And the first part of that is checking supply. But you're not checking supply of your units, you're actually checking supply of your opponent's units. That might sound kind of radical on the surface, but really in the flow of the game, in terms of contiguous steps you undertake to play, it's really not. I mean, what it amounts to is checking supply after you complete your movement. It just happens to happen during your opponent's turn. But also part of that opening phase is reinforcement placement, replacements, using your resources to build forces out of your force pool, and also recovering your air force. We'll get to that a little bit later as well. But sort of those things all to combine open up the turn for a player. At this time you also determine the mode of your headquarters for the turn. And really that just determines whether or not they're in an attack posture or what's called balanced, which is more of a, well, I guess defensive, but it gives you greater range for your supply. Now, going into attack mode costs you resources, so this is kind of the operational, strategic part of the game. You need to pick and choose when you're going to spend those resources to conduct attacks. But once you've completed that, you actually have your first movement phase. But it's not the full movement phase, it's actually called the special movement phase. You can move your ground units, you can relocate your headquarters, you can move along rail lines with rail movement. There's also air transport and naval movement. But there's some restrictions. Infantry units in a zone of control are not able to move. Infantry units, infantry type I should say, can only move half of their movement when they are allowed to. Motorized units like armor are allowed to move their full movement during this special movement. So it's kind of like that supplemental movement that many games have that comes at the end of the turn, except it comes at the beginning of the turn here. But a key aspect is that the infantry is very limited in their ability to move. That means if you have infantry lagging behind, you're not going to be able to rush them up into contact before your combat phase. So often you're planning your battles for the next turn during your current turn, because like these guys are too far away to get into range to attack. And you also put your air forces to work during this special movement step, sort of a precursor to ground combat. So once those activities are completed, then you move to the combat phase where your units in contact can conduct ground battles. There's also air combat that occurs. Once you've resolved your ground battles, you then move to the movement phase, which is the full movement for all units on your side. Infantry, motorized, they can all move at their full capabilities. No HQ movement, no rail movement, none of that other special type movement, just ground unit movement. Kind of after the battles have been determined, now you're taking advantage of any openings or opportunities you've created through your ground battles. And largely for the basic standard game, that's it. That's the game turn, or a player turn, I should say. There's not a lot of interactivity. When it's your turn to go, you're basically going. The one bit of interactivity is the air combats. You can sort of counter-strike with your air forces as when you're the defending player. There's also in some of the more advanced rules the ability to deploy reserves, strategic reserves, to sort of get in the way of any breakthroughs your opponent may have made, which of course means you have to have planned to have those strategic reserves. And also in some advanced rules there are partisans, and you can have partisans make their attacks kind of as a reaction during the ground combat phase. Now once that completes, flips over to the opponent's half of the turn, and the first thing you do is check your unit supply. Now the specific rule reads that your opponent checks your unit supply, but that seems more of an affectation than anything else. You're probably keeping track of it anyway, so just take it on, do it. I mean, for all intents, that step could have been placed in the sequence of play as the last thing you do in your half of the turn. So effectively the sequence of play is reinforcements, replacements, force pool management, special movement, combat, full movement, and then supply check. Now in the campaign game, there's plenty of stuff that happens around the economic side, but largely that is just there to fuel your reinforcement, replacement, force pool management step that you undertake every turn. Every design has to make choices about trade-offs they want to make to present the system and the feel that they want. This game has a number of abstractions, but also a number of things that are very detailed. One of the very detailed bits is the order of battle in the force pool. This is the Soviet force pool. This is one of the critical aspects of the game, that the forces are very different between the two sides. The Soviets evolve and change as the war progresses, and they have a very different way of putting together their armies. It's called raised army as opposed to assembled. You see there's a lot of things here, these little charts and these little exchange rates that explain to you how you take this kind of unit, you add some resources to it, you get that kind of unit. You add another resource to it, well, you get a full strength of that kind of unit. Guards units, these garrison units, and even over here you have this change box that explains how to take different forces, put them together to make up these much larger forces. These things will come into play as the war progresses and these new forces become available as reinforcements as the force pool is expanded. This is the Soviet reinforcement track. See, they get forces at prescribed intervals. These nice big large guard armies don't come in until July of 1942. And that's when you can start to raise them by combining them with other resources and forces. One thing you start out with is a large number of these early mechanized corps. They have the question mark on them. And they have a random chance of having some capabilities. This is a fairly good one. 8 attack, 4 defense. There are a couple that are, well, those are pretty good as well. But there are others that are much worse. 2, 5, motorized infantry. But as the war progresses, you basically have to start to remove these from play. And when you do, you stick them on this little track, and you pull off one of the large Soviet infantry armies, put it into your force pool so you can spend your resources on it to build it up. Here's a similar display on the Axis side, their force pool and their change and exchange rules. So they have these massive armies, like these infantry armies, these panzer armies, they have a combination of breakdown units. So they can break these down into 2 infantry corps or assemble the corps into one larger army. They can further break down into individual divisions. Obviously later in the war you're going to be taking a lot of losses. Probably won't be able to assemble these gigantic forces anymore. But you also have some capabilities that are generated through card play, like the ability to create these German motorized infantry units. And they end up being assembled from standard infantry units combined with resources to create one of these. Then they become available to you. And here's the Axis arrival schedule. Now they are a little more sophisticated in the rules surrounding it. There are reinforcements, withdrawals, additions to the force pool that can be constructed with the resource usage. There's also a withdrawal and then a re-entry at a later time. So a lot of things going on the German side as well. Not so much of a transformation as it is with the Soviets, but more like comings and goings. So every turn you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to manage your order of battle and your resources. Building things up, breaking them down, combining, changing. How best to use your limited resources to build your forces to do the things that you want to do. And there is a pretty significant rules weight behind all of this. I've actually simplified it a lot. There's plenty of conditions and procedures you have to follow in order to conform, especially on the Soviet side. Supply is actually quite simple. Seems a little complicated in the rules, but it's really pretty straightforward. Supply is traced along the map, blocked by zones of control and impassable terrain, but traced to a supply source. So a city like this is a supply source. You can also have something like a headquarters, which is underneath that token right there, as a supply source. So they would trace a line of communication back to an ultimate supply source, which would be a map edge or a capital city, something like that. They can do that, then they can act as a supply source. Then you have units, which need to trace back within the range of the supply source using, again, a line of communication. So if both those things are true, supply source is active, and the units can trace to them, they're in supply. If they can't trace, then they're out of supply. So this guy is not within range of any active Soviet supply source. This headquarters here is actually blocked by the German zones of control. And the headquarters is actually active because he can trace through the rail lines through his friendly unit. Now the other aspect is isolated. That is when you can't trace a line of communication to a supply source at all, and you can't trace a line of communication to any open, I didn't phrase that very well. When you can trace a line of communication, like these units here, they can trace over land, even through this marsh, all the way back to friendly ground, but they can't trace to a supply source, they're just out of supply. If you can do neither, you can neither establish a line of communication or a line of supply, you're isolated and subject to attrition. And really that's kind of it. Now the one wrinkle is that in attack mode, the motorized units can actually trace farther, double the supply trace to a supply source. So you use your cube here to mark that. So of course that's how German units can make those deep penetrating attacks. They can actually have 12 hexes to their supply source. So I'd call that pretty abstract. There's no, gathering of supply in any one particular place. Anywhere you have a supply source that can supply an unlimited number of units, there's no massing of actual material in any one place. It's just wherever you need it, it's available as long as you can trace to a source. Now, one interesting detail about supply sources, be they on map here or represented by headquarters, they're not automatically active when either the supply source changes hands or the headquarters moves. So if the Germans advance through this hex, take this supply source, they don't suddenly have a supply source there. Even if they remove that unit and end up with an active supply source, they actually have to wait for it to become activated. And what you do is when you capture something, or if you move the headquarters, you put the little countdown clock on it. What that means is that source won't be available for 3 turns. In each turn, you get to reduce that by 1. So at the end of the first turn, you'd replace it with the little 2 countdown. And then finally, go to the 1 countdown, and then out of there, it's an active supply source. Very similar with headquarters. If you move them, either voluntarily or involuntarily, when they take up their new position, they get a little countdown clock put on it. And again, they cannot act as functional supply sources or HQs until that counts down to 0. The air system is a combination of abstract and detailed at the same time. It starts with this air mat. For the most part, your air forces live on this mat. This represents their status, availability to fly. After they've completed missions, they go in here. They can either be in full strength or damaged. And if they're destroyed, they end up down here as damaged and destroyed. And what this represents is, I guess, the ground crews, refitting, repairing, getting your air forces back to availability to fly missions. For the most part, this is an automatic process every turn. Each side has the ability to recycle units from flown into available. If they're damaged, they're automatically flipped over to their full strength side, and then in the next turn they can then be cycled into available. You use resources to repair units out of destroyed into flown. They remain damaged, and then the normal cycle of refit and getting them ready for availability takes over. You can also use resources to purchase new units from the force pool, which puts them here, and then they begin that cycle into availability. Soviet ground crews are deemed to be less effective, so their rate of this cycle is about half of the Axis. That gives the Axis a real advantage, but over time the growing size of the Soviet Air Force will start to offset that a little bit. But there are also a lot of details in the air system. There's a lot of specificity in the units themselves. Each of the individual types are represented. Each type has capabilities that are represented. They also have a range, so S for short, M for medium. Soviets do have L for long range. Different types have different capabilities. Fighters have air-to-air combat capabilities, represented by the little 3 up in the corner. The lightning bolt is a strike value. The little bomb symbol is bombing capabilities. The shield is a hard target, whereas the 8-ball is a soft target. So there's a lot of detail on these counters that really expresses the different capabilities of the forces. That leads us back to a bit of an abstraction. Eventually you want to fly mission with those forces. You fly missions from air bases. air bases are any supplied city on your side of them, on your side of the line. Any supplied city. So you would take the forces off of the available box on the air mat, choose a city that you're going to call your air base, and then make missions within range, based on the aircraft type, short, medium, or long, of that city air base. So there's not specific geographic locations of your Air Force. Your Air Force is everywhere, wherever you want it to be. So if on one turn you want to fly the entirety of your Air Force missions from the perspective of this one supplied airbase city, you can do that. Tack everything right down here. 1 week later, in the next turn, if you want to shift the entire Air Force north, fly all missions out of that city, that's fine too. So it's definitely abstract. You know, it may seem a little odd to be able to just happen to have exactly the Air Force capabilities you need right when you want it, but it makes it a little simpler and easy to work with. But those missions offer a lot of detail. You have all of these to choose from. A close support mission, represented by that little chit, is basically assisting a ground battle. Interdiction is disrupting enemy ground forces, limiting their ability to function. There is an airfield strike, and that is trying to suppress or disrupt your enemy's air forces. Logistics, I think is that one. Attacking supply, HQ, rail capacity. Now, if you're going to be flying these missions, you're probably going to want to support them with fighters and escort. And if you're being attacked, you're going to want to try to intercept them with your own fighters. Then there are some other capabilities, such as striking at ports, striking at ships, striking, well, air transport capabilities, and then I think that one is for strategic bombing in the campaign game. So quite a wide array of individual air missions are possible. The abstraction of the air base concept, along with the specificity of the air base strike, I think leads to a kind of a strange situation. Since any city is a potential air base, none of them are declared to be so, you can launch an airfield strike against any city in range. So since there is no specific geographic basing of aircraft, essentially all aircraft are at every city, therefore subject to attack. Now the strange thing is that you have long-range aircraft that you would presumably want to base far away from the line so they can make, long treks to the front, make their attacks, and be safe from enemy reprisal. That's not quite how it works. If the Germans have medium-range bombers, they attack one of these cities right here, get hits. If your long-range aircraft are the only ones available to take those hits, they gotta get hit. Even though it seems kind of strange, you wouldn't base long-range necessarily right here. This would be where your fighters are. But, just by the nature of the system, they are as vulnerable as all other forces, even to those short-range airfield strikes. Combat is also fairly abstract in this game. There are really three flavors. First would be air combat. You place a mission along with some escort. The opponent intercepts. You would then have air combat, dogfighting. You also have ground combat, which is just ground units attacking each other. Then there is overrun combat. All of these are fairly similar. Like air-to-air combat is just totaling up the air values and then rolling a die, determining hits. There are a couple of modifiers such as hard targets or vulnerable targets that add, 1 or -1 to the outcome. Otherwise, you roll that die, consult the simple table, 1d6, and apply the results. It can be damages or aborted aircraft. I say the only thing that's a little odd to me is that if this is the mission and this is the escort, when the interceptor comes along, they actually fire first and they just sort of fire at the entire hex. Then if any escorts survive, they fire back at the interceptor. So I believe you can actually inflict damage on that bomber without actually engaging the escort. That seems odd to me. But I guess that would be a bit of a complication to have them fight through escort and then shoot at the bombers. Now, ground combat is fairly straightforward. It's just an odds ratio. The total attack against the total defense in the hex. There are shifts possible from terrain or attack mode headquarters. Also, some card play can provide shifts. There's also a special thing called support dice. You earn support dice either through card play or through ground attack missions, and you roll the support dice. For every full effect support die, you get a shift in your favor. So these would be full effect, and then if you're using armor in the attack, you'd get a full effect for that. Otherwise, you get a partial. So you can, if you have multiple dice, you can add up 2 partial to make a full, and so on. So you can affect the odds column through support dice and terrain and headquarters. Otherwise, it's just a 1d6 on a very attack-friendly CRT. Causes damages, retreats, and 1 or 2 hex advance after combat, depending on the outcome. And the final kind of combat is overrun combat. I think that's a fairly familiar concept. The way it works here is that only motorized units of at least 10 strength points can conduct an overrun. They can only attack a hex with a single one-step unit in it. So this is 2 units in one, so they couldn't attack there, but suppose it was like this. This unit would pay movement costs +1 to enter the hex and then conduct their attack. That's very simple. All it is a die roll against the defense factor of the target. So there's some modifiers for having, a heavy unit like armor against a light unit like infantry, or if you happen to be organizing your army by the larger units, this would be a +2 since it's a major heavy unit. You just roll a die. If it succeeds the defense value, you win, keep moving. If it's less than, you lose, take a step loss, and if it's equal, you have one or both sides have a choice as to whether or not to take a step loss or retreat. So really, combat is really quick to play, and now you'll have a whole lot of them because the CRT favors attacking in such a big game, but they resolve much faster than basically any other system in the game. So there's a look at some of the systems in this game. I found it interesting how some of the abstractions and specific details have worked together to make this whole. I've enjoyed this one so far. I definitely am terrible at it. Probably be a while before I even undertake a campaign game. Too many of the details of the turn-by-turn game to figure out yet. I'd say my only beef at this point is, some of the components are really starting to show a little bit of wear. Given the amount of play, I think it should not. Some of the counters are starting to look like I've had them for a year or two, rather than just a few weeks. Also, some of the coloration is off, both in the counters. Look at the map here, you can kind of tell this section cuts over right there, and there's a much lighter portion to that one. But those are small details. Most of the time I just ignore them. And I look forward to digging more into the campaign side of this game pretty soon.